In the heart of Albuquerque, a man once known as a quiet, brilliant chemistry teacher takes his first step into the shadows. Walter White, a father, a husband, a man broken by fate, transforms into something far more dangerous. He sheds his old identity, crafting a new one built on fear, power, and control. That name is Heisenberg, a symbol of cold precision, ruthless ambition, and the dark side of genius. This is the story of a man who went from making formulas in a classroom to building an empire in the underworld. Walter White was invisible to the world, underpaid, underappreciated, and terminally ill. But hidden inside him was a storm waiting to be unleashed. Walter White became one of the most feared names in television history, Heisenberg. This is not just the story of a man making meth. It is the story of ambition, morality, family, and the dark side of the American dream. This is the rise and fall of Heisenberg. Faced with death and desperation, Walter made one choice that would change everything. He turned to chemistry, not for science, but for survival. Walter White died the moment Heisenberg was born. His alter ego became a legend, feared in the underworld, and admired by millions of viewers. Heisenberg wasn't satisfied with money. He wanted an empire. But power always comes with a cost. The man who built his empire on lies finally saw it crumble. Walter White's story was never about victory. It was about consequences. Walter White's journey from teacher to kingpin redefined television. Heisenberg lives on, not just as a character, but as a cultural icon. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was something far more real. A man who showed us that greatness and destruction often walk hand in hand. Remember the name. Heisenberg. The ordinary teacher. Every story of transformation begins with a moment of stillness. A man living an ordinary life, unaware of the storm building inside him. For Walter Hartwell White, that ordinary life was one of quiet disappointment. Walter lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico. By day, he was a high school chemistry teacher. He wore beige pants, a green shirt, and a pair of glasses that seemed to weigh heavier with each passing year. In his classroom, he taught equations, molecules, and reactions with precision, yet his students stared blankly at their desks, barely listening. His brilliance was wasted on the disinterested. But Walter White was not just a teacher. He was a man of immense knowledge, a chemist whose potential once promised greatness. In his youth, Walter had helped co-found a company called Gray Matter Technologies, a startup that could have made him rich beyond imagination. Yet, through a mix of insecurity and misjudgment, Walter sold his stake for a few $1,000s. That company would later be worth billions. Walter, instead, was left behind, invisible, bitter, and forgotten. Outside the classroom, life was no kinder. Walter had a wife, Skylar, who was expecting their second child. He had a teenage son, Walter Jr., who struggled with cerebral palsy. Bills piled up, obligations multiplied, and Walter, once again, was cornered by the reality of his small life. To make ends meet, he worked a second job, not in a lab, not in a company where his skills could shine, but in a car wash. There, in a neon apron, Walter scrubbed hubcaps, cleaned engines, and sometimes even wiped the cars of his own students. Nothing was more humiliating. Nothing cut deeper into his pride than being invisible, not only in society, but even in his own home. At family gatherings, Walter's achievements were dismissed. His brother-in-law, Hank Schrader, a confident DEA agent, dominated conversations. Hank's job was exciting, dangerous, and masculine, the kind of career Walter never had. While Hank cracked jokes and downed beers, Walter sat quietly, his presence barely acknowledged. To everyone else, Hank was the man. Walter was just Walter. Yet behind his silence, behind the glasses and the soft voice, burned something dangerous, resentment. Resentment that the world had stolen his potential. Resentment that his genius had been reduced to scribbles on a chalkboard. Resentment that while others thrived, he lived paycheck to paycheck, scrubbing cars to survive. Walter White's life was defined by limits. He was a man trapped by money, by missed opportunities, by family responsibility, and by his own pride. But pride, when cornered, is the most volatile chemical reaction of all. For Walter, the breaking point came not in a classroom, nor in a car wash, but in a sterile hospital room. On his 50th birthday, Walter collapsed. He awoke to the news no one wants to hear. terminal lung cancer. He was given months, perhaps a couple of years at most. The countdown had begun. The diagnosis was more than a medical condition. It was a mirror. For the first time, Walter saw his life for what it truly was: unfinished, unfulfilled, and insignificant. He had been a spectator in his own story. Now, time was running out. Every bill, every debt, every obligation pressed harder. The thought of leaving his wife and children without stability consumed him. How would Skylar raise 2 children alone? How would Walter Jr. afford college? How would they survive? In that moment, Walter faced the truth that haunted him for years. He had nothing to leave behind. No legacy, no fortune, not even respect. Just unpaid bills and forgotten dreams. But chemistry had taught Walter something. Every reaction, every transformation, begins when one element collides with another. Pressure, heat, or catalyst, something must trigger the change. Walter's catalyst had arrived. Cancer was not just a death sentence. It was an awakening. "I have spent my whole life scared," Walter would later say. "Scared of things that could happen, might not happen. But now I realize fear is the worst of it. That's the real enemy. So no more. I am awake." The Walter White who taught chemistry, who scrubbed cars, who swallowed humiliation, that Walter White began to die the moment he heard the word cancer. Something darker, sharper, more dangerous began to take his place. A new man was stirring inside him. A man who would not bow, who would not settle, who would no longer accept invisibility. But for now, in the early days, Walter was still the teacher, still the husband, still the father. A man with good intentions. A man looking for a way out of despair. What he could not yet see was that his search for survival would lead him into a world of crime, violence, and power. A world that would transform him into someone unrecognizable. Walter White believed he was stepping into darkness to save his family. But in truth, he was stepping into darkness to save himself, his pride, his ego, his hunger for recognition. The story of Heisenberg was beginning. And it began with a man who once thought he had nothing left to lose. The diagnosis and desperation. Every man has a breaking point. For Walter White, it came under the cold fluorescent lights of a hospital room. His body, once strong enough to carry the weight of his quiet suffering, had finally betrayed him. It began with a cough. Just a cough, nothing unusual. But over weeks, it grew harsher, deeper, echoing like a warning bell from within. On his 50th birthday, Walter collapsed, gasping for air, the world spinning around him. Sirens, stretchers, the sterile smell of disinfectant. His birthday ended not with cake, but with diagnosis. Stage I lung cancer. The words were clinical, emotionless, delivered by a doctor who had said them 100 times before. But for Walter, they rang like a death sentence. The tumor was inoperable. Treatment could extend his life, perhaps 2 years, maybe less. In that moment, time itself became his enemy. Every tick of the clock was borrowed. Every breath was numbered. Walter sat in silence as the doctor explained chemo, radiation, costs, side effects. The words blurred together. What stayed clear was the image of his wife, Skylar, expecting their second child, and his son, Walter Jr., standing awkwardly in the corner. Their eyes searching his face for hope, for reassurance. Walter gave them nothing. How could he? At home, Skylar began to plan. She researched treatment options, insurance coverage, alternative therapies. She spoke of hope, of survival, of fighting back. Walter remained quiet. His silence was not strength, it was calculation. He knew treatment was expensive. Insurance would cover some, but not all. Debt was inevitable. Bankruptcy loomed like a shadow. What haunted Walter most was not the thought of dying. It was the thought of dying a failure. Of leaving his family with nothing but bills and pity. Skylar, he believed, would always see him as the timid man who washed cars. His son would remember him as the weak father who couldn't provide. And his newborn daughter, she would never remember him at all. At family dinners, Hank, his brother-in-law, spoke loudly of his work at the DEA. He laughed, joked, bragged about drug busts, about criminals in handcuffs. Everyone admired Hank's courage. Walter sat quietly, invisible again, the man in the corner. Then came a moment, small, almost casual, that would change everything. One afternoon, Hank invited Walter to ride along on a DEA raid. At first, Walter refused. He had no place in that world of guns and danger. But curiosity tugged at him. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was fate. Walter rode with Hank, listening as he bragged about the millions made in the meth business. He spoke of criminals earning in a week what Walter couldn't in a lifetime. Money, mountains of it, stacked in dirty houses, hidden in walls. As Walter watched the raid unfold, he saw chaos. Addicts, criminals, shattered lives. But behind the smoke and broken glass, he saw something else: opportunity. Chemistry was his world. He understood reactions, purities, processes. And if these men could make millions cooking poison in filthy labs, what could he do with his genius? That night, Walter sat awake in bed. His wife slept beside him, unaware of the storm raging in his mind. The hospital bills lay on the nightstand, unpaid. His son's future, his unborn daughter's life, his wife's survival, all balanced on numbers he could never meet. The thought was insane, unthinkable. A high school chemistry teacher, a cancer patient, cooking methamphetamine? Yet the more Walter considered it, the less insane it seemed. It was logical, cold, precise. Chemistry had taught him that under pressure, elements transform. He was under pressure now, and transformation was inevitable. He told himself it was temporary, just enough to build a nest egg, just enough to secure his family before he died. He wasn't a criminal, he wasn't a thug. He was a man with months to live, a man cornered by circumstance. The first step was finding a partner. Not just anyone, someone connected to the drug world, someone who could sell what Walter could make. The face of one man came to him instantly: Jesse Pinkman, a former student, a dropout, a boy Walter once taught about reactions and compounds. Jesse had failed chemistry but passed into crime. Walter knew where to find him. Desperation had made the unthinkable thinkable. Cancer had made the impossible possible. Walter White had not yet cooked a single gram. But the decision was already made. The line between teacher and criminal, father and outlaw, had begun to blur. It was no longer about if he would break bad. It was only about when. The first cook and the birth of Heisenberg. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to become a criminal mastermind. For Walter White, it began with an old RV, a lost student, and a single desperate decision. Walter found Jesse Pinkman exactly where he expected: hiding, running, surviving on the fringes of Albuquerque's drug scene. Jesse was a former student, a dropout Walter once failed in chemistry. Now, Jesse failed at life itself. He cooked cheap meth, sold small batches, stayed one step ahead of the DEA. At first, Jesse laughed at the idea. His old teacher? Cooking meth? Impossible. But Walter's offer was different. He didn't want Jesse as a chemist. He wanted him as a partner, someone to handle the streets, while Walter handled the science. They bought a used RV, an old mobile home with broken windows and peeling paint. To most, it was junk. To Walter, it was a laboratory. His laboratory. The desert stretched endlessly as they drove. Inside, Walter unpacked equipment with precision: beakers, flasks, burners. The chemistry teacher returned, not to a classroom, but to a criminal workshop. Jesse doubted. He mocked. But then Walter lit the flame, measured, mixed, refined. Hours passed. At last, Jesse stared in disbelief at the crystalline blue substance in his hands. Pure. Perfect. Unlike anything he had ever seen. In that moment, Walter White's genius was unleashed. And with it, Heisenberg was born. But perfection has consequences. Word spread quickly. This meth was not ordinary. It was art. Dealers wanted it. Addicts craved it. The streets buzzed with rumors of a new player, someone untouchable. Yet the desert held danger. Their first cook ended not with celebration, but with bodies. Dealers crossed them, threats were made, guns were drawn. Walter, the man who once erased chalkboards, now erased men from existence with chemistry. Phosphine gas filled the RV, suffocating their enemies. Walter White had killed. He told himself it was defense. He told himself it was necessary. But the truth was simple. A line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. The timid teacher had cooked his first batch. The desperate father had drawn his first blood. Heisenberg had entered the game. The rise of an empire. Success is addictive. Walter told himself it was only temporary, only enough to leave behind money for his family. But when the first pile of cash hit the table, something inside him shifted. Skylar asked questions. Where was the money coming from? Walter lied. At first, small lies. Teaching extra classes. Helping friends. But lies breed like shadows, multiplying until they consume the light. Jesse and Walter began cooking more. Their product became legendary. Pure, beautiful, unlike anything else on the market. Dealers scrambled to distribute it. Addicts begged for it. Competitors tried to copy it. None could. Soon, Walter attracted attention from bigger players. Men like Tuco Salamanca, violent, unpredictable, ruthless. Deals turned bloody. Fists and guns replaced handshakes. Yet Walter did not flinch. Instead, he stared down Tuco with the same calm he once showed in class. When threatened, he demonstrated his knowledge, crafting an explosion with chemicals right in Tuco's office. The message was clear. Heisenberg was not to be underestimated. Every cook, every deal, every lie brought Walter deeper into the empire business. He no longer thought of himself as a man dying of cancer. He thought of himself as a man finally living. At home, he grew distant. Schuyler sensed the darkness, felt the shift. Walter Jr. admired his father's sudden confidence, unaware of the source. Money piled up, more than Walter had ever dreamed. But with every stack came a hunger for more. A hunger not to survive, but to dominate. The chemistry teacher was gone. The empire builder had arrived. Breaking bad relationships. Empires are not built on chemistry alone. They are built on lies, manipulation, and the sacrifice of those closest to us. Jesse became more than a partner. He became family, though Walter never admitted it. Their bond was complicated. Teacher and student, father and son, master and servant. Walter saved Jesse and destroyed him, often in the same breath. Schuyler, once kept in the dark, began to uncover the truth. At first, she suspected affairs. The lies didn't add up. Phone calls, late nights, hidden money. When the truth surfaced, it was worse than she could have imagined. Her husband, the man she married, was a drug lord. At the DEA, Hank, Walter's own brother-in-law, chased Heisenberg relentlessly, blind to the fact that his enemy sat at his dinner table every weekend. The tension grew unbearable. Hank praising his progress in the investigation, Walter smiling silently, hiding behind his mask. Each lie widened the cracks. Each cook poisoned not just the streets, but Walter's own home. Breaking Bad was not just the story of a man breaking the law. It was the story of a man breaking every relationship he once held dear. The fall of Heisenberg. All empires crumble. For Walter White, it began with pride. His product dominated the Southwest. His money overflowed storage units. Yet it was not enough. He wanted recognition. He wanted the world to know his name. But pride invites enemies. Gustavo Fring, calm, calculated, ran an empire of his own. Gus offered Walter safety, power, resources, but demanded obedience. Walter could not obey. The war between Gus and Heisenberg was inevitable. Bombs exploded. Friends died. Walter outsmarted Gus, killing him in one of the most iconic showdowns in television history. For a moment, Heisenberg stood alone, victorious. But victory was an illusion. The DEA closed in. Hank discovered the truth, shattering the family. Jesse, betrayed and broken, turned against his former mentor. Schuyler, consumed by fear, begged Walter to stop. The empire collapsed as quickly as it had risen. Walter became a fugitive, hunted, despised, abandoned. His fortune, the millions he once killed for, became meaningless. His family wanted nothing to do with him. His empire was ash. The king had fallen. Legacy of Walter White. On a cold morning in Albuquerque, Walter White met his end. Alone, bleeding, surrounded by the empire he built from chemicals and lies. He had secured money for his family, but lost his soul in the process. Yet Walter White did not die forgotten. Heisenberg became legend. The blue meth lived on in the streets. His story lived on in fans' hearts. Breaking Bad redefined television, showing that a hero can become a villain, and a villain can still command sympathy. Walter was not black or white. He was gray, complex, human. His legacy is not simply that of a drug kingpin. It is the legacy of a man who revealed how far ambition, pride, and desperation can drive us. Walter White may have died, but Heisenberg will never be forgotten. Because as Heisenberg, he became a legend, feared by his enemies and unrecognizable to those who once loved him. But behind the hat and the glasses stood a man who had lost himself to the empire he created. Walter White may have started with good intentions, but Heisenberg? He was the danger. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.